So thanks a lot for staying to my presentation. So I'm talking about Happy 17. I don't know, have you guys heard about Happy? Anyone? Happy? Okay, so, and Express? Node.js? Okay, so Happy is like Express, but way, way better. And it just moved to the newest version, so I'm talking about that. So I'm a software engineer at BEN, Branded Entertainment Network. We basically do product placement inside a lot of movies and TV shows, so you probably know about us, but you've never actually know about us, so it's kind of cool. I love JavaScript, especially backend UI, it's not for me. I like Star Wars and yeah, also kind of play saxophone. So what is Happy? So Happy stands for HTTP API, and it's basically a Node.js framework for building web applications, and it's much easier to work with than Express. It's just hit the most recent version, like version 17, and was a completely rewrite. Like the guy was asking for support on Patreon like over a couple of months ago until he got some money that he could write. Okay, now I'll focus and develop and improve this. And it was the first framework to fully support 100% async await pattern on JS. So basically this new version basically takes out a lot of crap that was there to support some edge cases, and it's much stabler and much faster. So we can no longer support more than one connection per server, because why would you do that? Like no one does that, but Happy supported that. We also dropped tails with like a concept that you could grab the event after it was answered back to the client, and you could attach like 2 extra stuff afterwards. There's no mod support for node domains. Node domains are a really good thing that whenever there's an unhandled process rejection or an unhandled exception, the process wouldn't just collapse. But it isn't the support from the node itself. It's not the best. So basically it was dropped for this version, and maybe sometimes it will come in the future. And yeah, basically some shortcuts just disappeared. So basically this is how would you set up a server in Happy. And what it changed was basically the plugin, and that's a problem with JavaScript, that you have functions that can have properties which look like kind of a mess. So now everything is just an object with properties, and then you have properties that can be functions. No more mess. Basically some naming changes. You can still use like config instead of options, but it's moving to options because it's clearer what you're doing, and it's fully async await. So this is awesome. Probably some of you guys have used async await. Who has used async await? Okay, so it's like promises but done well. So that's why promise exists. So the major difference now is that there is a reply interface. There's no longer a reply interface. There's an H toolkit. And H, it stands for Happy. And it's basically how can you modify your request, how can you answer back the response and stuff like that. Like can you play around with whatever was sent back to the server. So nowadays, you can just simply reply immediately with a response on a handler. So that's a handler, so it's just a function. And before, it got like 2 arguments, the request and the response. And you had to do something like the reply. You had to do like reply and call the function with some value. Now you just answer it immediately. You can still use the old way. You can change stuff, but you use the H toolkit. So this is the Happy lifecycle changes, and one of the things it's so much better than Express. It's that every request that comes through your app has this kind of extension hooks. Maybe the picture is not that great, but basically it has like hooks like on request, on response, on auth, on credentials, after handler, something like that, that you can hook whatever you want. There's no middleware magic going on. You know where you're putting stuff. You know what's going on in request, and the flow is pretty straightforward. So basically the change is there is a new one called on credential. That's after you authenticate the user on your server. You can still do some magic there, so it can be helpful if you got some really weird business case that needs to be looking at, and also the tails that disappeared, as I've said before. So also the authentication step. So basically it's that hook on the request is coming, where you say, okay, this is like the username is coming from the query, and I'll authorize it. I'll rename it as the user, which is kind of a stupid one, but you could like do a database query, look for the access token, stuff like that. It's changed, as now you have to use the H toolkit to say that the user is authenticated or not. And this kind of, instead of just throwing errors and it will be unauthenticated, you can still do it. But if you are like doing h.unauthenticated, it's more clear what's going on, and those kind of errors are then mapped back to the response. So you get on the response header, you get what schema you're not following up with. You need to specify a default validation that's no longer. Before, if you specified like an authentication step like OAuth or something like that, it would be like the default one. Now you have to specify that mandatory. It's not implicit anymore. And yeah, and basically there's a new hook. You can see the on-credentials hook. It's a new one that can just modify the request, and basically it will be the Jedi Master, whatever you passed into the credentials, instead of just the user. So you can keep modifying stuff with a known logic. There's also a really good feature, or one nice thing, that's the takeover function. So basically, it means that whenever you're inside a handler, if you call the takeover function, basically it goes to the end. It doesn't pass through all the steps, because you're saying, no, I just want to get this out of the function because, I don't know, either is unauthorized, and that's done already in the framework, but there might be some other use case that you want just to skip and not go through the rest of the framework. So for here, you can see, for example, pretty clearly that for this request, the hello, there's an extension on pre-handler. So before the handler is called, there's this function, and it just says goodbye. It won't print the actual handler, because it takes over it and goes to the end of the function. And also another cool thing about these new JavaScript things that have just come in is the symbols. So the continue, when you just do some stuff on the handler and just continue the processing, it's no longer a function. It's a symbol, which is kind of nice, but yeah. So that's how you can change the response inside the Happy lifecycle. So when you're on the post handler, you can just reply with the change you want. Before, you needed to do something like alter directly the object or something like that, and it's much cleaner since it uses async await. You're returning the value, right? But this value is actually wrapped inside a promise that will be resolved, but you don't even need to think about it, right? You just return the value, and it gets processed, which is pretty cool. Then there's the thing about no domains. So this was a really good feature on Happy, but it was causing a lot of troubles and performance issues. But basically, now you have to catch them on your own. You have to do and handle explicitly what you're going to do with them. There's a bunch of plugins that do that. One is called Poop, which, yeah, that's it. and then there's also the Joy, because most people that don't use Happy probably use Express, and they use Joy. It's basically for schema validation. And now they changed that whenever you made like a request and it was asking for a name, and it should be a string, and you were sending an object or something else, it would say, hey, that's a bad request, name must be a string. Now it doesn't by default, because basically it's a security issue. You're exposing internal functionality and how that could be used, the endpoint, to external users, and that can be tricky. So by default it's turned off. It's pretty easy to change it, because in Happy everything is so like plugins on top of plugins and composition. That's really easy to recover this functionality with a couple lines of code. So one other really cool stuff is how I taught you about the tails. Like you could grab a response after it went to the client and do something, but that just disappeared. And because the logic was really complicated, you assigned a function into it, and then you got it back on the end. So basically, if you're doing async an async function, you can just do it before returning the response, because it's async, so it will get run on the next event loop thing, right? If it's a sync stuff, you could do set immediate, but that's not pretty. And the pattern that I came up with was basically Happy gives you this request object, and inside there's an app thing that you can put wherever you want. It will be cleared after the request is being processed, so you can put that wherever you want. So everything that you need to be parsed for that specific request. So basically what you do is create something like tails, which is just the same functionality, right? But done better and not that tricky to do. And you just add some function to do the functionality that you want. And afterwards, as I've showed you, there's a couple of extension hooks. One of them is the response, and then you can handle it. See if there's some stuff that needs to be done, and do it properly without taking care of taking into account the tails, because it was really, really messy. So why should you use Happy if you use Express, or why would you update this? Because Happy is just very well battle tested. If you can look at it in lots of blog posts, this is just an awesome framework to work with. And if you have big teams, you can split the code very well inside your team. The code is very easy to understand. The guy who writes it, it's a bit of a genius. It's very well maintained. The community is awesome. There are plugins for nearly anything. And basically, the guy who built it the right way. So there's a full migration guideline that tells you whatever you need to update in order to make the transition. And some of the stuff you really like just find and replace, and you can in a few hours, depending on the size of your application, or a couple weeks, get it ready. And there are some cool stuff, like for example, it says that the performance improvement is like 500%. It looks like, wow, that's huge. But it doesn't matter that much because it's so fast already that those 500% and those tests, the performance tests, are usually done in a really specific context, like replying hello world. Nobody does it in production, right? So there's no much more sense. That doesn't make much sense to say that that's a good thing. Just a quick trivia, for example, I don't know if you guys know Ren and Stimpy. It was the old cartoon. Basically, Happy is named after Ren and Stimpy. That's why we got a bunch of stuff like Happy Joy, because it was Happy and Joy was the name of the theme song that they sing a lot. There's Mr. Horse plugins. There are a couple of plugins with weird names, but they're really, really interesting. Yeah, and that's basically it. So if you guys have any questions, if you guys think that Express is good, change your minds. Happy is much better. And yeah, feel free to ask anything, or we'll meet up afterwards.